Hi there everyone, this is Devin Olson, and today I'm going to be teaching you how to use 3D Studio Max to rig and animate a first-person weapon with first-person hands for a first-person view in a video game. So let's begin. In my 3D Studio Max scene, I have a Dragunov SVD sniper rifle, which has many components, such as the magazine, the reload cock arm, the scope, the trigger, the little thumb components, maybe the bullet exit point, and the places where we put our hands. Now for this tutorial, we're only going to focus on a few of these components. We're only going to focus on the magazine, maybe the trigger, the points where they put the hands, the reload lever, and that's about it. The scopes and other little components that you want to animate maybe on your weapon can easily be animated once you go through this basic tutorial as well. Alright, so let's talk about the mesh itself. The mesh is a single mesh that is an editable poly, and that is for good reason. You might think to go ahead and go to the element mode and start selecting different pieces and deattaching them from the main mesh, but I highly advise not doing that. What that creates is a lot more meshes to have to maintain through the animation portion, as well as it creates a lot more overhead in performance when you bring it into your 3D engine. If you imagine, anything that needs to be controlled by a bone or some sort of rig has to have a modifier to it. So every mesh that also has a modifier on it is that much performance overhead when it's being ran in the game engine of choice. So if you have every component on this weapon divided up into different parts, and then they had modifiers that allow them to be controlled through bones, you can see how much performance overhead you're going to get versus just using one mesh that's controlled through one modifier. Okay, great. So now that we've identified the different components that we're going to be focusing on in this tutorial, let's go ahead and set up the bones for those components. So switching to a left view, let's zoom in on the weapon, and going to the Create tab, and making sure that we're on the System rollout. Let's choose Bones, and we're going to create our first bone. We'll create the first bone to be for the main portion of the weapon. So just somewhere out here on the side, we'll click and drag, and then click again a second time. And then the third time, go ahead and right-click. Press Delete, and that will leave you with a single bone. Careful now though, because you still are under the bone creation. So to select this, make sure that you finally right-click to turn off the bone creation, and you can finally select it to move it or scale it as you see fit. So this is our main bone. We'll go ahead and just move it up to the main portion of the gun. And we'll create some more bones. That will be for the magazine. We'll create one for the trigger. Create one for the reload lever. Maybe one for the left hand hotspot. And one for the right hand hotspot. Okay. Again, we're still under the creation mode, so right click to turn that off, and then we can move these around. Okay, some of these bones may seem a bit large for the actual component that we're wishing to control, such as the trigger. So go ahead and just select that bone, and you can go to scale mode, hitting P for perspective and Z for zoom if you need. You can scale this guy down a bit. And maybe we want to scale the other ones down some as well. Magazine, I'm going to leave that big because when you're moving and animating this piece, it's nice to be able to have the bone a little bit sticking out of the mesh so that you can grab it easily. The reload lever doesn't need to be that big though. We can bring this down. The left hand hotspot, that can go down some. We're not going to be touching that very much, so we can go inside the mesh. And the main bone for the weapon, we kind of want to be large and in charge so that we can grab it easily. We'll be grabbing and moving this bone around the most throughout this animation portion. So having it accessible and not hidden inside the mesh is going to be a huge helper. Okay, make sure that going to a top view, you don't have your bones somewhere way out here off to the side. They need to be in the center of the mesh or respective to their component in the center of their component. So the lever arm that we're going to be animating sticks out the side of the weapon, so that makes sense that it's over here. Whereas the main bone of the weapon needs to kind of be in the middle of the weapon because it's going to control, well, the main weapon. Alright, now we must name our bones. So clicking the bones and going to the modifier tab, we'll call the main bone main. Call this one magazine. Call this one lever. And this one will be left hand or left hotspot. This one will be right hotspot. And finally trigger. Great. Now let's select the mesh. And we're going to add a modifier to it called skin. So scrolling down our modifier list, we'll add the skin modifier. And the first thing we want to do with the skin modifier is we want to add all of our bones to the modifier list. So clicking the add button, it will prompt you to select the bones, and because we named them, we know that we're selecting the correct bones. So clicking and dragging, you can multi-select, and then click select. Alright, so let's talk about the skin modifier. The skin modifier is a way to deform vertices based on 3 different points in space, or rather, bones in space. So when we have these bones added to our list here, every vertice has the potential to be pulled in 3 different directions, or rather 3 different bones. So if I was a vertice that lived on the magazine here, I have the potential now to be pulled by the magazine bone, the lever bone, and maybe the main bone, or maybe some other bone in the mix of those 3, but only up to 3. So each vertice has a weight direction of 3 directions. This is really good for character rigging, such as hands and elbows, knees, things that need to bend like cloth or skin, hence the skin modifier. For rigid elements, using the skin modifier proves to be a little bit more challenging, but it's nothing that we can't overcome fairly quickly. So to start, let's pick a particular part of our weapon mesh that we want to be controlled by one and one bone only. So coming into our modifier stack here, let's go down to our editable mesh, and we'll turn element select mode on, and let's select the magazine. We'll scroll down, and we're going to say hide unselected. Okay, so everything but the magazine is now hidden. We'll go back up to our skin modifier, and we're going to turn the edit envelopes mode on, turn on vertices, and we're going to say select by element. We'll click one of the vertices in the magazine, and you'll see all the vertices in the magazine light up, and that's because we told it to select by element. So if I have this off and I choose a vertice, it's only going to select one now. So it's real helpful to have select element turned on when you're going through the different parts of your weapon or individual components that you want to be controlled through one bone or another. Okay, so we have our magazine's vertices selected. Let's go down in the skin modifier a bit to the weight table, and it's going to open up a new window that has a series of columns and rows. Now this represents every vertice right now that we can currently see in the scene. So if we come down here to the bottom drop down box, we can say only selected vertices, and we want to select all, and you'll see that it has a particular column selected. Now the column that it has selected, and again we have a number of columns out here, the columns represent the bones that we've added to the skin modifier, And the one that's currently selected is the one that we have selected up here in the add list. So if we want the magazine to be controlled by the magazine bone, in the skin modifier add list, let's click the magazine bone. And you'll notice in the weight table, the magazine column is now highlighted. And we have all the vertices for the magazine selected and visible. Holding Control, right-click on this column for magazine, and you'll notice that all the values turn to 1, meaning that they are 100% weighted by this bone and this bone only. No other bone or column in our weight table now affects these selected or visible vertices in the weight table. Let's close the weight table. Go back to our element, and we're going to say unhide all. Okay. Next, let's go to our trigger, hit Z for zoom, and we're also going to say hide unselected. Go back up to our skin modifier, choose the trigger in our add list, and turn on edit envelopes, and select the vertices for just the trigger. Now we'll scroll down and go to our weight table. And again, we're going to say select all vertices on the weight table and only show me the selected vertices that we have in the scene right now. Scroll out to the selected column for trigger, and again hold Control and right click, and that will set them to 1. Okay. Go back to our edit poly, say unhide all, and we'll move on to the reload lever. Selecting those elements, we'll say hide unselected. Go to the skin modifier, choose lever, turn edit envelopes on, select these vertices, and again bring up the weight table, select all, find the lever column, hold Control, and right click. Okay. Let's go back to our edit mesh, unhide all. And now we must do the opposite for our main bone. So we'll select not only these lever parts, but the magazine and the trigger. Okay. And this time we're going to say hide selected. So those are out of the view, and the rest of the vertices that we want to weight just to this main bone are visible. So going up to the modifier again for skin, selecting main, turning edit envelopes on, simply hit Control A. Scroll down to our weight table, edit select all, make sure it's still selected vertices only, and let's find our main column, hold Control and right click, close the weight table, go to the edit poly modifier one last time, and we will say unhide all, and we'll just turn off all modifiers and click somewhere else in the scene. Okay, so now that we've weighted the vertices to the individual bones that we needed accordingly, leaving out the hotspots for the left and right hand, you might notice that when you go to move, say, the main around, the other parts don't follow the main part, and the hotspot points don't follow the main bone either. So we need to address that. So what we need to do is we need to create a helper middleman between linking these bones to this main bone. Now, if we were to actually just select all these different bones and link them using the link tool directly to this main bone, you're going to run into an issue where whenever you move one of these bones by itself, it's going to be rotating the whole weapon, because it will have a parent-child relationship to this main bone that will influence the orientation of the main bone as well. So, and instead of doing that, we'll go to the Create tab, and we'll go to the Helper, and create a single dummy. And we're going to make that dummy right around this main bone so that we know that it's a helper for the main bone. Great. Let's go ahead and name this main bone helper. And hitting H on your keyboard, let's select all the bones except for the main and the main bone helper now. Okay. Using the link tool, we'll click and drag, and you'll see that it creates a series of lines that indicates all the bones we're about to link to a particular object. So we'll drag those lines up to our helper and let go. And now all the bones are linked to the helper. Now using the select tool, we'll select the helper and we'll link it to the main bone. Great. Be careful because you're still under link mode. So if you go to try to select another object, you potentially might start linking it to other things without knowing it. So back to the select object and then click in the scene. If we move the main bone now, because of the hierarchy parent relationship between the other bones, the helper dummy, and the parent bone now, everything should move as a solid object, and the individual bone should control the individual parts as we need. Alright, well now let's talk about the arms that are going to interact with this weapon that will be in our first-person view, or our field of view. I have a grid down here that represents my unit scale that I set up through Customize Unit Setup for meters. And you can also set up the size of your grid by going to the Angle Snap tool, right-clicking on it and going to your home grid and setting the amount that is visible and spacing. Going to the Create tab and System again, you can create a biped character. If you click and drag, and he comes with a whole set of properties, such as the amount of spine links, if it has a ponytail, the amount of toes, the amount of fingers, and so forth. Go ahead and create your biped now and set up its configuration as you see fit. And if it's orientated in the wrong direction of your weapon, with its main biped root bone selected and the Angle Snap tool on, you can rotate it in 90 degrees any direction that you need. Now I happen to have a biped character that I've already merged into the scene that I use for our game that matches this scene file scale. So the first thing we want to do is we want to hit H on our keyboard and we want to select all of the bones and mesh. And helper object for our weapon, and we want to create a group. Just call this rifle. And this allows us to be able to move everything as a whole and not manipulate any individual part accidentally. And coincidentally, you can also still scale it while retaining all of the skin and bone link information. Hopefully your weapon is already of scale to your scene before you started doing anything, but if at this point you need it to be scaled differently, do so now. Okay, so in this tutorial, we're only going to be animating the upper arms. We're not going to be animating so much the head or any of the other biped parts such as the legs and the torso and pelvis. I went ahead and grouped my bones together, so I'll just open that group up so I can select the head, chest, and all the rest of the bones down here. And we'll right click and say hide selection, so that all we're left with is just the arms. Now, you'll notice that sometimes you'll be working with a biped that has these wrist helper bones that are more or less frozen. And what I mean is, if I was to select this entire side and say hide selection, these things are still there, these helper bones for your wrist. And the reason that they're still there is because they're frozen. So if, for whatever reason, you want to hide these two, just make sure you select them and you say unfreeze, and then you can hide them. For this tutorial, we'll just leave them in and keep them frozen. Alright, let's move on to the animation portion now. Starting with the right hand, or the trigger hand, go ahead and select that hand, and come down here and turn Toggle Auto Key Mode on. And what this will do is anytime we make an action or a change, it's going to record that in the timeline down here with a keyframe. You see that? So if I was to now make an action with the slider out a little bit further, it's going to make another keyframe and another one. And if I scrub that timeline now, you'll see that it makes that motion accordingly. So starting at frame 0, we'll grab the hand and we'll move it in place. We'll roughly move it in place. Now you'll start to see that the upper arm and elbow is kind of more in instead of being an angled out and in. This is the time to sort of fix that now. If you leave it this way in your rough adjustments, when it comes time to be moving the weapon around, you'll start noticing that the elbows start pushing in further and further and further, and it becomes a nightmare to undo. So we'll go ahead and sort of give it some broad shoulder starting, some wide shoulder starting, and then grab the hand again, rotate it, and move it in. That's a little better. You want to go further out some. You really want to be overly realistic at this point, to give yourself plenty of room for when you go to move these weapons around, that you don't have the elbow starting to collapse in and buckle on itself. Okay. So again, that's really sticking out far. We'll go ahead and rotate this. Notice I turned my snap angle on in this portion. It really helps a lot as far as getting things kind of adjusted to a grid space. Okay. You want to get his palm sort of flat, because under a tight grip it's not going to be angled. And I can guarantee you, while shooting this weapon, everybody's going to be having a very tight grip. Okay, so here's the first fold point between our hand and the finger, or the palms and the fingers. So that sort of needs to match up against the handle of the gun. And so if we rotate that just a tad and pull it back, start to see that it gets a little bit better. Like so. Okay. Check out what it looks like underneath. Might need to adjust it so the palm is a little bit more 90 degrees. Like that. That's a great primitive start. Alright, fingers. These can always be a nightmare if you don't know about this trick. And this trick is that if you select the first bone in your link of fingers and double click it, it will select all the rest proceeding out. Why is that helpful? Because if you then rotate them, you'll see that they rotate in conjunction as a whole, not just a single bone. So I don't have to come in here and say rotate, rotate, and then rotate. It's much easier just to select it as a chain and then rotate them. Okay. Careful when you do it in these directions because you will get some weird bending of a finger when it's chain selected like this, and it looks like he's unnaturally rotating his finger. You can do it in little increments because the phalanges themselves tend to not be as rigid in the direction of their IkeA. They're a little bit flexible. Okay, so coming up to the thumb. Thumbs are pretty important because they tend to give away to a lot of web between the thumb and the palm. So if we were to look at this palm on our left hand, you'll see that if there was skin on here, the skin would create a sort of a web between the actual thumb and the palm, whereas where it actually connects is way down here. The skin actually connects way up here, creating a web. So if you're unnaturally moving the thumb around too much or spacing it out or stretching it, you'll get this really, really strange effect between that web and it becomes very stretched. So just be very careful at the way that you manipulate your thumbs. Manipulating it this way is going to cause that effect a lot. So very little this way and maybe more down than anything. Okay. And then we can, from the middle bone, do a chain selection, leaving out the first one, and still do the grip effect. Great. Now we'll look at the trigger finger. You can see it's kind of going through the actual trigger portion a bit. First bone could be straightened out a little. And then we'll start to wrap it. And this time I'm not using the chain selection for finer control. Looks like it's still kind of going through it. So maybe not that much of a wrap. Great. And then when we want to animate him pulling this trigger, it's as simple as moving the middle bone. Can bring it up a tad. Okay. So all of this movement has been stored into this single keyframe. And because we had the auto toggle on, we were able to make several adjustments without 3D Studio Max coming in and taking my hand and resetting it back to the default position when we merged in or created our biped. So it's very important that you did all these adjustments with the auto key mode on and working under that first frame. Now that we've got our basic look or our grip, it might be good to go ahead and from the palm, double click it and it will select all the hand objects or bones. Go up to the Motion tab, and under the Motion tab you'll see a bunch of different rollouts. One of those is called Copy and Paste, and this is where you can actually copy a pose. So we created this pose right here, and it would be nice to be able to store this for later use, maybe even for another weapon. So the first option at the top of this rollout is Copy Posture. So whatever bones that you have selected, and you click this, it will create a copy, or it's going to copy all the position, rotation, and scale values of that current selection for later use. I can even, if I wanted to, come in here and say apply paste posture to the opposite. So the other hand could get that same posture that we just saved out. This really speeds things up. So we'll undo that. All right. We'll go ahead and close the posture. Just keep it in the back of your mind and try to save as many of those out that you could reuse on other weapons or other animations. Okay, before we go any further, let's select our weapon. And we'll go up to Group, Open, and we'll reselect the palm of our right hand. Okay, while still under the Motion tab, let's open up the Key Info rollout, and you'll get a series of sub-rollouts. One of those is called IkeA. One of those is IkeA. Go ahead and open it. And the first thing you'll see is this arrow right here that allows you to select either a body or an object that we want this palm to be parented to in an IkeA fashion. So selecting Object, let's go ahead and click the Record or Set key. And this will set a key at 0, and we'll choose the Select and hit H on our keyboard. And now we want to find the right hotspot and choose Pick. You'll probably get a warning, just click Yes, and you'll see that it assigned it to it. Sometimes Max is a little bit buggy, so what I recommend is that you now unselect the palm and reselect the palm, and you'll see that it put it back as a body. So change the object again, and now on the IkeA blend, change that value all the way to 1. And if you move your timeline out, you'll see that this keyframe is now turned yellow. That indicates that it's a set key, and it is weighted 100% to a particular object, not body. Okay, so what does that mean for us? That means if I was to come in here and select this parent bone, or the main bone, on the weapon, and I was to move it around, the hand and the arms on the character biped adheres to it. And it adheres to it in a fashion that the arms still retain IkeA. You see that? That's going to help us be able to animate one spot and still have the biped arms adhere to it and animate as if they weren't really linked to anything and we were animating the arms by hand too. Really speeds the process up. Okay, so now let's focus on the left hand. So again, we're going to give it some big elbow room. We're going to rotate his wrist out a bit. Let's go ahead and select the weapon and choose Group, Close. Because it's a group, when I move the group around, it will also move the parent bone, the main bone, and because the main bone is moving around, it's going to move all the children bone around. And because those are all moving around, again, the biped hand will adhere to it. So if we move it back some, we get to the point where our left hand would be positioned. Now, you'll notice that he has an unnatural, he has the gun unnaturally going through his chest. A little trick about first-person animations for games is that a lot of times the animations that you're being put in front of your face or the field of view is nothing that could realistically be done with a weapon. Meaning that if a person was to actually carry or run with that weapon in that particular fashion, you too would be having a butt of a gun going through your chest. So it's more or less just about keeping in mind that this animation is going to be for a field of view reference, not an observing reference. So we will never really observe the butt of the gun going through the chest. We will be observing just the top portions of the gun at different portions of the animation. Maybe also the full gun at a reload state where most likely the butt of the gun will not be going to the chest because it will be held up further. So don't be too worried about where the back of this gun falls and needing to keep it right in the shoulder for first-person views. Okay, so let's try to get this hand in position. A nice primitive one, and you see, because we stretch that elbow out, it's not collapsing way into the weapon here. Okay, that looks pretty good. I mean, that's a good start. Okay, so now, again, we want to come in here, select our left palm, and under the key info, IkeA rollout, we'll go ahead and add a planted key. And we'll hit H on our keyboard with the select tool. And we're going to choose the, oh, I'm sorry. Don't forget to open up your weapon. Now we can select the left hotspot, make an object, and set its blend value to 1. Cool. One of the cool features that setting a planted key has is the select pivot. So if I was to come in here and click this, it's going to give me a representation of this hand. Okay, so it's telling me that right now this left hand, it doesn't represent all the bones there, but it gives a rough estimate of where it can kind of predict the pivots are. It's saying that sort of my pinky first phalange joint is the pivot. I would realistically like it to be the wrist. So as I move this weapon around, it's going to bend here, not in there. Let's go ahead and do that for the other hand too. Set pivot. It was already set at the wrist. Great. Okay, so we have our hand set up on the hotspots that we needed, and we are ready to actually animate this weapon. So, coming into the main bone, we know that where we have it right now, or maybe up just a tad, and again, this is all relative because when you bring this into your game, you can adjust your field of view and push these hands out further or closer to your camera. So your camera might be back here, right? Or the field of view might be right here. You're looking. So let's rotate this a little bit so that we have a little bit more room for our arm. And then we'll bring this over here slightly. Maybe in. This is a very large weapon. Okay, so this is more or less our default position, or our idle, or our starting animation when he pulls the weapon out. So taking that frame and moving it up, let's create a keyframe. And moving that up to, say, maybe 10. And then creating another keyframe and taking the whole thing and moving it down and rotating it. Between 0 and 10, he lifts the weapon up. Great. As you build these sections that are considered the frames of the different parts of your animations, you need to create little spacers. So I move typically by 5 spaces out. So if we ended on 10, we'll come out to maybe 15 and start the next portion. And grabbing the last frame that we worked with and moving it out there, we'll start the shoot animation. So between 15 and 17, we probably want his finger to pull the trigger. So going back to frame 15 And having the finger selected, we'll use the set key. Oh, it looks like you have to just actually animate it. Just move it, and it will create a key there. Go out 2 frames, and then he'll pull the trigger. And then go back to unpulling the trigger. Okay. At the same time, we want to go to the trigger bone, set a key, and during the time that it's being triggered, or being pulled, we want to rotate and move, right? Now I know I'm going to get people asking me why I didn't set up an IkeA for this. It'd be easier so that you could just rotate it, or why didn't I move the orientation up top so that when I rotated it, I'm just, it's just for the sakes of this tutorial. There's many different ways that you can make it so that you could have set the orientation at the exact point where you want it to rotate while I rotate it, and it rotates in the correct fashion, so I don't have to do a rotate move. But we have our starting keyframe, so it's just as easy to go back to where we were. So there's a trigger being pulled. Probably want to move this down here. And then the last frame, put it back, so it gets pulled and put back, right? Pulled and put back. Great. So now we need the actual recoil of the weapon. So between 15 and 17, we'll go ahead and move it back and up 1, maybe 2, and then lift it. So that's the effect. Bam. Okay. Looks like it could probably give you a little bit more kick. And then as we come to rest, you got to remember the energy from the blast of the weapon is forcing a rigid body that's already stiff to be pushed back. So the natural reaction, or as Newton would say, the opposite and equal reaction, is to try to go back into the position it started. But because it's not, a machine, it's going to overcompensate as it comes back and then lands into its final resting place. So we get energy that pushes it back, and then our natural rigid body is going to try to put it back into position, so it's going to basically go back out and up and down. So back, and then up, back to our starting point, but maybe out still a little bit and down because we've overcompensated slightly. And then finally we hit our final resting spot. So the effect is boom, energy, compensation, rest. Okay, so now we actually need to start the reload of the weapon. However, that requires us to be able to lift our left hand up off of its linked hotspot and link it to another bone, such as a magazine, and interact with that. But the problem is that 3D Studio Max only allows you to link your hands, or your biped objects, to another object using the IkeA link method once. So you can only link it once to another object at any given timeline. So how do we overcome this? Well, if we were to select our main bone right now, we see that we have a total of 26 animation frames. If we select everything, we can confirm that we have a total of 26 animation frames. So if we select our biped, and we take the first frame, because everything's controlled through this set key, and move out another set key while holding shift and dragging, to 26, we have a time frame between 0 and 26 that we can export our animation out. So if we go up to the top of our motion tab, one of the options it has is save file. So if we click this, we'll be prompted to save this file. And what we want to do is we want to uncheck it to save max objects and uncheck save controller lists and have it save a current position and rotation of our timeline. So from 0 to 26. If this number isn't what you expect it to be, try clicking this icon right here and it will try to find the last keyframe in the timeline. So between 0 and 26, it's going to create a file for us that will save every keyframe between 0 and 26 for us. So we'll call this rifle. Okay, and now we want to load it up. So we go load, choose rifle, and you'll see that our timeline has now been filled up with all the keyframes that we've built so far. And what that allows us to do is go to the end of where we wanted to start our next animation, select our hand, and now be able to work with it on another hotspot. Because again, we can only use one hotspot at a time on our timeline. So starting at frame 30, let's create a new keyframe, and we will make the hand move out to the magazine in 5 frames. So go to 35, and we'll need to play with his wrist and rotate it a bit. Let's turn angle snapping on again. Just a real rough grab for the clip. It's probably easier to look at it from underneath to get that palm lined up. And then move it in place. Maybe move it back a little, give some room for the thumbs. This is a pretty big clip, so he'll have to have a wide grip, which means his fingers need to come out some using the chain selection. Like so. So between those frames, you'll see that he goes to reach for the clip, but he starts to move his wrist directly in to the magazine clip. So we got to create an arcing frame that supports the motion in which we want him to interact between those 2 points. So he kind of uses this guiding point to get where he needs to be. Now, also, his fingers should probably open up about here so that he looks like he's going to grab something. So chain selection again, we'll make a nice wide open movement. And then he'll go from a grip to open palm to look like he's grasping something to actually grabbing the magazine. Looks like he's clipping a little bit in there too, so we can give him yet another supporting one. So it kind of supports it in there. Space these out a little bit more. tends to be that when you have two frames up against each other and you make a sudden movement, it's a lot more noticeable. So if you get that, just space them out a little bit and he'll move in the direction you need, like so. Okay, so we got his hand in the position that we want it to be, so now we just need to lock it to the magazine. So going under the key info rollout, and you'll see it's still highlighted as selected as a left hotspot, but there's no set plant key in here, so it really doesn't matter. So the first thing we'll do is we'll set a plant key and change it to be a magazine and be an object with the blend value of 1. Double check it. Yeah, it stayed as object, good. And we're now in a state where we can animate the magazine bone however we want. So at this point, the weapon probably should have been rotated as he goes to reach for that magazine. So here we are before he lifts his hand up off the front of the gun, his left hand, and then here we are grasping it at 36. So probably between 26 and 32 maybe, we want to lift the weapon up. But before we do that, we need to go back to our right hand and set a new plant key. Now remember, it's still stating that it's adhering to the right hand hotspot, but there is no planted key anymore. By going to the last keyframe, 25, and clicking Set Key, Object IkeA1, confirm it by reselecting it, and yes. So now we can lift the weapon using the main bone. Between 30 something like that. Maybe even a little higher so it's in the field of view of the camera. Maybe out some. That's pretty good. So this jumps to that hot spot for us, but these guys out here probably need to be adjusted again. Just rotate it and move it out. These were just helpers, so they're not really important. They just guide it to the spot it needs to be. This guy has a little bit of a movement there. If you get that between two spots, right, where it's seemingly the same position, but there's a little bit of movement there, you need to reinforce each frame with itself so that there's no chance of a movement in there between. Okay. Now we got a little bit of a pop because this helper guy is a little bit drastic in where it is that he is kind of guiding it. Bring it back down a little bit here. So it's more like that. And that one is a bit out and drastic, so we'll move him in. So he's going for the grab. And then he connects. Okay? And that's at frame 35. So at this point, we know that we can select our magazine frame. We've never animated it yet, so it doesn't have anything on the timeline. set up a frame at 0 as well as one at 36. And then from 36 to what, 40, we will have that bone be moved down and out to exchange it, right? Let's talk about this. If you get a transform that is just in world coordinate, not local coordinate, or in local coordinate, and not in a way that you want it to move, you can come up to here and change this to like screen. So you'll see that no matter where I look, the X and Y positions are changed to where my screen is. So that makes it a little easier if I know I would just kind of want it to move in that direction, but my transformer isn't really allowing me to. Well, I can do that if I keep it on screen. There we go. Maybe down here too. Okay. Remember the pivot point we set to the wrist there? That's a hearing right now. So he goes down and grabs a new clip. It looks kind of like there was a little bit of a clipping there as he pulled it out. So let's keep that. Instead of screen, let's change this to world. Or no, I'm sorry, local. And we'll make him pull in a straight down direction before anything. So it's a complete disconnect. And maybe we space these out by one frame. So he grabs and then pulls down and then grabs for a new clip. Okay. So obviously the next frame would be him coming up with that clip and then putting it in. Okay. We could also maybe at this point have it so that his hand releases from the clip and pounds the bottom. But that's going to require us to now let go of the magazine so that it's not set key and IkeA'd to it. And then independently, freely slap the bottom of it. So at this point, we know that after he slaps the bottom of it, we want his hand to come back to this hot spot. So let's not worry about the slapping right now. Let's go ahead and just save out what we've got so far by selecting the biped. Save. Make sure we're not saving any objects or controllers. And we click this button. It says 36 frames, but I count that we're at 60. And that's because we need to make a new keyframe here. I'm sorry, we were at frame 46. That's where we stopped. So we'll save this and hit all time frame, and it goes to 46. Save as rifle. Yes. And then we'll load it up. Okay, let's replant the right hand. Going to the last frame. Object. IkeA blend 1. Okay. Then we know between 46 and 50, we probably want him to move his hand down and out. And straighten his wrist. Somewhat. And make a fist. Oops. Like that. Let's change this from local to world. So So between those frames, he's going to let go and get in position to smack the clip in. So we need a helper because he is kind of clipping through the let go process. And that helper should probably help guide it down too. So he's out and down, makes a fist, and finally he's going to hit the bottom. Alright. Now at this point, because he hit the bottom, you probably want the weapon to move up a little bit. So the last frame we worked on when we moved that main bone was 30, so let's move that up to 50 now. And between 50 and 52, we'll have a little bit of a movement to it because it got slapped. Okay, so that should look like this. It looks like the movement needs to happen just a little later. So it's coming down. Oh yeah. The actual time that it takes to hit the bottom needs to be much quicker, I think. So he gets in position and he smacks it. Just a quick smack. And that will result in the gun starting here to move up. So quick smack. And then it falls back into position. Alright, so now we probably want him to turn the weapon completely over so that his left hand can reach the reload arm and pull it back. So from 55 to, from 53 to 55, we probably want him to turn that weapon over. Like so. And probably move it in a little bit. And out. Okay. And we'll move his hand up there. Which is up there. Let's change this to screen. Looks pretty good. Let's rotate it slightly. Bring it down. Maybe by local. And we'll adjust his grip. And at this point, we're going to attach this hand to the lever bone. So that we can now animate the lever. We've never animated it yet, so we'll set a keyframe. Also put one at 0. And he'll slide it back by local. And typically, you'll have a particle system in the game engine that will spawn a bullet release particle that's also part of your shooting, where it releases shells. If you wanted to have that here, you probably wanted to identify that component early on and create a bone for it, and this would be the time where you would animate it flying out. But you probably should reserve that for particles. It's just easier to maintain. At this point, we probably want his hand. Let's go ahead and increase our time frame to maybe 80 frames. We want his hand to come back up top. So at 60, we'll move back. Let's just use the original frame that it was at. Okay, so looks like he's pulling it down and bringing it back up. Now the bringing back up part should be done by a spring inside of the weapon. So you can realistically, at this point, just have him let go. And this is a good time to talk about the other options that we have up here. So there is one called a set free key. So we're still linking to the lever bone, but we're going to set a key free, or a free key, so that we can have the bone still go back up here and not have the hand be adhered to it, but still be linked to it. None of these tools alleviate the problem of us still only having the option to link to one bone at a time. So I probably will see comments about people talking about using this more often, but in this scenario we had 3 unique points in interest where he needed to touch and interact with a different component on the weapon. So he actually needed to grab and link to 3 different portions of the weapon. And so we'll go ahead and set the free key. And we'll tell his grip to loosen up. And maybe rotate his wrist off of it. And you see it still pivots at the wrist point, because it is still part of a link. Move it out. And it will go forward. So the effect is that he pulls it down. Reaches forward, pulls it down, and lets go as it goes back on its own. Now the spring back can probably come back much sooner in a single frame. So pulls it back, and at the same time it goes forward. Snap. Okay. And then the weapon is going to reset its position. Probably where it was at 10. We'll do that at frame 70. And then at frame 65, we'll keep it locked here. So he has time to play with the chamber Maybe we'll move these back a whole 5 frames each. It's time to play with the chamber. It slaps back. And we'll move these in some more as he brings it back down. Okay. So this guy had a few clipping problems. One is when he was coming up, he went through the weapon. So let's see if we can get him to come out a little bit. That connecting point seems a little early. And these guys can come out 1 frame. So he reaches over the weapon. That's still a little bit in it. Turn local off. Okay. So he connects it with it there, and probably want to move these again out 1 more. So that the time he connects, he grabs it and then pulls down, and it snaps back. Maybe a little bit of a delay in how long he holds it. Okay. Let's keep it locked a little bit longer out here. So he has time to cock it, release it. Maybe 1 more frame. Before it starts going back. So at this point, we know that at frame 65, he's going to be resetted. So let's grab frame 10 on our left hand and move that to frame 65 as well. And then we'll just fix the clipping that he has here. There we go. So the whole animation is that he goes for the magazine, pulls it straight down and out, exchanges it for a new one, slaps it in, turns the weapon over, grabs the reload lever, pulls it back, lets it slap spring-loaded back forward, and then resets to the default position before he shot. Okay. So at this point, we know that he's going to put the weapon away. So let's go ahead and bake the animation down one more time. We stopped at frame 65, 65, yep. And we'll load it back up. And at frame 65, we're going to now tell the left hand to once again be linked to the left hotspot by object with a blend value of 1. And then we will tell our right hand to also be weighted at 1, object to the right hand hotspot. And then we can come into our main bone, move our timeline out to frame 75, because to pull the weapon out was 10 frames. To put the weapon away, it should be 10 frames as well. And then we'll just copy frame 0 out to 75. So from 65 to 75, he's putting the weapon away. Okay. Great. Puts the weapon up, shoots it, reload sequence, puts the weapon down. There might be other animations that you might be interested in building out, such as a melee animation, but that really depends on your game type. These are the basics that you need for pretty much all your weapons. Finally, we know that we're kind of done at frame 75, so let's trim up our timeline to 75. One last time, I swear, we need to copy a frame out to 75 so that we capture the whole state. And then we'll load it up. So we have our whole timeline. Okay. So why did we do all that in the last step there to save everything out into a single timeline? Well, if we were to unhide everything, unhide all, and let's go ahead and maybe close our groups. What we basically have done is we've made the animations isolated from both the biped and the weapon. And this creates a unique instance in the fact that this biped is no longer relying on the weapon to animate it anymore. If we go in here and tell these hands to stop linking to things, so they're literally linked to nothing anymore, and then we close the group again, that weapon and those hands are just synced together at the same time. And that means that I can take this biped and I can now rig or skin many different character meshes to it. It doesn't matter the shape of the hands or if it's a different character. They can all be rigged to the same biped system. And then the weapon itself can be flipped out. All the weapons can be flipped out over that different character type. So the animations for the weapons are isolated out, and the biped system is isolated out to their own animation timelines, purely for the fact that we can run many different character meshes over the same biped system and have the hands and all the different weapons that you'll have in your game sync up together over all the different character types that you have. It's pretty neat. It is important to note that that last step where I told the hands to basically link to nothing at the end is a required step, at least for the Unity 3D engine. Otherwise, the hands will still try to adhere to an unknown point in space, and your animations will come in with your hands flying all over the place, like some angry articulating person. Alright, and with that, we have created a fully animated first-person weapon with first-person hands for a first-person view, in your video game engine of choice. Thank you very much.